The foyer smelled of lemon oil and cold metal. High heels clicked once, twice, then hesitated as if listening to the house itself. Warm light pooled on the marble, but the air felt too still, like a room holding its breath. She paused with her hand on the big brass knob, and, for a moment, the silence answered with a soundless pressure against her eardrums. The chandelier did not sway. The piano in the corner was mute. The familiar portrait of the family looked like a photograph of someone else. When Helena March entered, the slippers she had left on the floor every night were not where she had left them, and the grandfather clock did not chime. None of it belonged to the evening she had planned. Helena March, the woman who had built a public image of implacable control and discreet generosity, felt, for the first time in months, the old gut ache of surprise. She folded the letter unopened in her palm, wooden taste of worry at the back of her throat. Before she could step further, a hand, calloused and urgent, found the side of her wrist and squeezed. "Stay quiet," the janitor breathed into the hollow of her ear. His voice was a rough coal whisper, the words a chain that closed around the doorway. "You need to see this," he said, and his eyes darted toward the corridor where the light under a nursery door leaked like a wound. How long had someone been living in the house with that kind of secrecy, she wondered? How long had the house been lying to her? The question hung and refused to be answered. Who could have thought that silence could scream so loud? Helena moved like a person walking into a photograph, senses rearranged. The scent of lemon oil mixed with the faint bleach of hospital corridors, the tacky sweetness of a child's syrup bottle abandoned on a side table, the dry scrape of an envelope against a mahogany shelf. Through the crack in the nursery door, a pale sliver of light lineated the floorboards, and there, in the sliver, her youngest was small and hunched, hands pressed to his face. There was a hand large and controlling pressing down on his shoulder, and a hulking silhouette bending over them both. A soft toy, a faded lion with one ear missing, lay on its side. The sound of muffled words leaked out, low, ordering, the kind that carved obedience into a child's breath. The janitor, Miguel Reyes, kept his palm tight on Helena's wrist. He had worked in the March estate for 6 years. He had keys to rooms Helena never visited. He had the kind of quiet that knew houses and the way they kept secrets. He had seen the figure at the nursery window 3 nights in a row and had learned to watch without being seen. He had always thought his duty was to maintain the house, not to notice the life it held, until the night he noticed that the life inside had tilted. They stood there, pressed into the shadow of the oak staircase, and watched without moving. Helena's breath did not sound like hers. It sounded like a borrowed thing that would not last. She tried to read the frame of the man in the doorway, to catch a glimpse through his back, but he moved with the ease of someone who believed he owned not only the home, but the rules of those inside it. He sang a low, crooning sound under his breath, a tune Helena did not recognize. The music was small and domestically cruel. The child's shoulders shook, and the man laughed, a sound without light. The janitor's jaw tightened. It was in that lace of sound that Helena felt the old, shame yet familiar knot, guilt. She had been away on meetings, endless flights that blurred cities into a gray line of corporate kindness. She had signed checks, opened foundations, cut ribbons. She had let someone else tighten the screws of daily life. Who had she left the small things to? The discipline, the supervision, the bedtime rituals that stitch safety into a child's night. The house told a story she had not read. Miguel was the first named ally. He was not the only witness. There was Lydia, the nanny, who kept the children's schedules like a ledger and who had started to hand in late-night messages with trembling handwriting. There was Darren, the driver, whose radio hummed the comings and goings of the staff, who had noted a new car arriving at odd hours. There was Priya, the house manager, who cataloged invoices and had added, in a margin, the phrase, "something wrong here."
There was Officer Nolan from the local precinct, patient and methodical, who, in a phone call, had asked Helena to be careful. There was Marta, a neighbor with binoculars and a memory that she kept in notebooks. There was Dr. Jameson, a child psychologist whose gentle questions unlocked small truths during a trauma consult. There was Camille, Helena's sister, who had long suspected that the family image did not match the family home. Each of them moved like a small pendulum, making tiny decisions that would swing the whole life of the March household. Helena stepped closer to the crack and heard the man's voice clearer. It had charm in it, the silvered charm celebrities used for cameras and then stored away. It was velvet that concealed barbs. "Hello, darling," he said softly. "Don't make any trouble." He sounded like a friend. He sounded like a sentence. The child stopped crying and held his breath. The hand on the child's back was not gently correcting behavior. It was owning the child's lungs. Helena's mind cataloged the evidence even as her body trembled. The obvious question, the one that would not leave her, was how had someone so close to the family come to hold that much sway? Who had vouched for
Him? In the stillness after the man left the room, the janitor let his hand fall to his side and drew a breath so sharp it seemed to cut the room in two. He led Helena down a service stair that smelled of oil and old coffee and showed her a set of frames on a shelf. The frames were paperwork thin and unremarkable. Background checks, references, a certification of some kind. In the comments line of an employment file, a single approving note stood out, initialed in Helena's own handwriting from months ago when she had signed to hire household staff on autopilot from a meeting plane. Names had the power to authorize. She had inadvertently lent it. The house had accepted the mistake like a second skin. Backstory arrived like rain, wet and heavy. Helena had not always worn the tailored suits and softer smiles she now displayed at charity dinners. She had grown up in a town where the hospitals smelled like menthol and diluted disinfectant, and where her father worked nights on the loading dock. She learned to carry groceries in both hands and to shut bathroom doors only when necessary. Her mother, a teacher with chipped fingernails, hummed on the porch while Helena learned to count money and not feelings. In college, Helena discovered leverage. She learned contracts as one learns a language. She learned how to make people feel safe in public and unimportant in private, because that is how deals are kept. When her husband, Ezra March, died in a car accident, the public echo of grief was immediate and profitable. But the private ache was slow and surgical. In the months after, Helena began constructing a fortress of work. She invested in companies, in ideas, in visibility. She hired people to fill the rooms she could not inhabit. She entrusted bedtime to nannies and breakfasts to chauffeurs. The house became a calendar of responsibilities, and the children became items to schedule. She told herself it was prudent. The truth was sharper and smaller. She had been trying to avoid the interior of pain by arranging its surroundings. That avoidance, she now realized, had left gaps where an outsider could insert himself and speak rules into the spaces she had abandoned. The backstory was not an excuse. It was an explanation of how a woman who controlled markets could lose track of a child's nights. The man who had settled into that gap had a history too. His name was Victor Hale. From the outside, he carried the easy biography of reinvention. He had been a consultant in his 20s, a charismatic presence at seated dinners, a man who knew how to fold listeners into confession. There had been whispers years earlier of a small scandal at a private club, an accusation of overstepping that was smoothed by hush money and strange smiles. Victor moved in the kind of circles where charm is currency, and where reputations are malleable. He arrived at the March of a state as a solution, carrying a portfolio of assurances that included a certificate from a well-known behavioral coach and an artful note from a minor celebrity. He was the kind of person who would step into the light and let the flash make him public while the real commerce happened in shadows. He called Helena at first with solutions for her schedule, then with a proposed intimacy that appeared as rescue. He showed up, bearing an idea for discipline that he framed as structure.
He told Helena what any exhausted parent wants to hear, that he could manage the nights, that he could instill calm, that he knew how to make children obey. Under the gloss was a man used to scripting consent, a man who escalated control like one tightens a rope until the other person moves in the only way left to them. His backstory was a ledger of small manipulations and an appetite for ownership that had been tempered but not erased. He was practiced at appearing necessary. After the first night of watching, Miguel set a plan into motion. He started late nights with the vacuum in rooms he claimed needed polishing. He lingered at the security desk to pretend to sort deliveries. He swapped shift times with Darren, the driver, so he could be near the nursery when lights dimmed. Lydia, the nanny, who had first handed in late messages and then removed them from the trash in shame, began to leave notes folded into children's jackets. Priya, the house manager, began cross-checking purchases and noticed items for the house listed under Victor's personal account. Marta, a neighbor, produced a photograph taken from her window, grainy and terrible, but the silhouette matched. These people, nominally peripheral, formed the thin spine on which a response could be built. They spoke in small conspiracies, in the low voice of the people who do not want to be wrong about their fear but cannot be silent either. Helena listened, and for the first time in months she began to plan like the person who kept reputations, with patience and a knowledge of leverage. The first formal act of alliance was small and clandestine. Miguel installed a tiny recorder beneath the nursery dresser, a device the size of a coin. Its presence announced to no one except him and Helena when she signed the tiny receipt with a hand that trembled. The recorder caught the man's voice, his commands, the child's soft compliance and stifled crying. The audio file was a jagged, unbearable thing to hear. It mapped power with a clarity that witness statements could not always render. The janitor watched Helena press a finger to her lip as she listened, felt the rasp of the order sink down her ribs. He had never thought of his job as moral before. He had thought his job was to make the floor shine and not to make people repent. But the recording made him a participant, and participation has a way of demanding courage. Helena wanted to do the right thing quietly, to remove the man and call a lawyer and move on. But quiet would not be enough. She needed proof the law would accept, and she needed the safety of a plan that accounted for the reach of a man who knew how to present himself as indispensable. The revelation was partial and devastating. The recording played through Helena's phone as if through her veins. The man's laughter at one point was too soft, like someone who knows an audience will always forgive charm. There was a moment where the child whispered "Mama" in the dark, and the man's voice boxed the word. The file ended with a sudden thump and then silence. Helena's hands were slick. She looked over at Miguel, who stood with his jaw set, his palms thick with soap and the memory of seeing. It was then, there in the dimness of the service stair, that the first CTA emerged between them and the world. If this touched you in the same place, if you have ever held your breath because of something you overheard and did not speak, you are not alone. Share one sentence in the comments below that says, "I saw," and then, if you can, tell someone you trust. The voice of the house had been denied before, but community can become a room that hears what power would hide. The little plea landed in the air, and Helena felt its strange relief. It made her less alone, like opening a window a crack in a room that had been closed for decades. Then she went to the lawyers. What followed were scenes of small, bureaucratic warfare. Helena called Lydia into her office, and they had a long conversation that was part confession and part coordination. Dialogue filled rooms the way light would, bending to edges and spilling into cracks. Lydia said, "I thought it was discipline. I thought maybe you had asked." Her voice shook. Helena said, "I asked for love and learning, not this." Lydia answered, "I am sorry." There were 10 exchanges like that, each a careful stitch. The driver, Darren, when questioned, admitted to noting the incoming car in one of his logs and changing routes to avoid confrontation. Priya produced invoices and a bank transfer that showed Victor reimbursing a vendor for a supposedly private nanny item. Officer Nolan sat in his cruiser and listened to Helena, then to the janitor, then to the recordings. He said, "If we go in without more, he could claim entrapment." Helena said, "What do you need?" He said, "Proof, chain of custody,
and a commander to sign off on a warrant. The conversations were mundane and devastating at once, the language of policy shaping a human problem into files. Victor, when confronted for the first time, used charm like a smokescreen. He smiled and offered small apologies that were vehicles for more control. He said, "I only want what is best." He said, "I help because you cannot possibly be here for everything." His sentences had the cadence of persuasion. He invited Helena to dinner, suggested they speak in private, offered her a project that would keep her busy and distracted. Helena, who had once believed in bargains for the sake of peace, found that she could not be distracted. The house, her children, the recordings would not let her be distracted. She spoke in answers that were short, surgical. She told him, "No." He leaned forward and said, "Are you sure? You could lose more than you think." They traded 10 razor-edged lines in that kitchen, each one a probe for weakness. Victor's final remark before leaving that night was quiet and precise. He said, "Remember who keeps the doors open." It read as both threat and rehearsal. Tension widened like a crack across the estate. Victor became more watchful and more theatrical. He would appear at school pickup to smile at teachers, to offer aid, to plant his presence like a stake. He forbade Lydia from speaking of certain topics in front of the children. He began to rewrite the family rules in ways that controlled small freedoms. Bedtime stories became monitored. Visits to family friends were curtailed with excuses about schedules. The children's laughter grew clipped in the corners. In the nursery, Helena found that toys had new rules marked on them in a childlike script that was not her own. The lion toy had a red stitch across its mane and a note tucked inside, reading, "Be quiet and behave." The shame of it was that she had left those threads to be woven by others. Now she had to pull them apart. Each new limit Victor created was a small surgical operation on the family's autonomy. Lydia cried in Helena's arms after a night when Victor had punished the child for speaking out of turn, and Helena felt rage like heat, like the sun caught in a glass jar. Helena made a decision to act in public while protecting private safety. She hired a discreet investigator, Ava Lynn, who specialized in domestic surveillance and ethical evidence collection. Ava was methodical and had a way of making the legal system seem like a language to be learned, rather than a temple to be feared. The plan required patience. They could not simply confront Victor in the house and expect the police to hold him without uncontestable proof. The recordings would not be enough unless the chain of custody was impeccable. So they staged interactions that would not put the children at risk, but would make Victor reveal patterns. Miguel, who had been quiet and observant, volunteered to be the daily eyes. He would keep the nursery door ajar enough to capture more audio and to mark times. Lydia would document any marks or behavioral changes in the children in a private diary Helena kept under her mattress. Darren would adjust driving logs to create verified timelines. Priya would flag bank transactions and receipts. These small actions felt like boots on a slow march toward daylight. The evidence collection unfolded with technical care. Ava explained the protocol in terms Helena could hold. Each recording had to be labeled with timestamps, device IDs, and GPS metadata when available. Files were backed up to 2 separate encrypted drives, each with a signature hash to prove no tampering. Paper trails were copied, stamped, and stored in a lawyer's safe box. Witness statements were notarized. The entire process had the cold, exacting clarity of laboratory work. It required Helena to watch every step, to sign off on each transfer, to become guardian of a new kind of truth. The chain of custody was written and sealed. Nobody could later claim the evidence had been planted. It was a small, legal fortress. The night they had the warrant was a study in controlled crescendo. The police moved with a slow competence. Officer Nolan and another detective crossed the marble floors with the weight of official purpose. The janitor and Lydia waited in the service corridor. Helena stood at the top of the staircase, watching as the team approached Victor's private study. She remembered the way he had sat there once, smiling,
and felt the counterpoint of that memory like a bruise. The arrest was quiet. Victor raised his hands as if in a theater where dramatic gestures are still applause. He had prepared a performance for being called out, and yet the script he expected did not cover the presence of a house he thought he had owned. They read him his rights. He said, "You are making a mistake." He kept repeating that line even as officers cuffed him. He tried the charm with cameras, with the press that had already begun to gather in the street like vultures smelling a meal. Publicly, he sought to rebuild his image. Privately, he was facing allegations that had evidentiary teeth. That was the turning point, where performance met process and the law. When the household's quiet conspirators watched the man who had tried to own them be led down the stone steps into a vehicle. The trial moved at the pace of institutions. Depositions were taken, and the recordings were examined by forensic audio experts who confirmed there had been no alteration. The procedure was described in court documents with technical language that mapped to a human story. Each step of the chain of custody was recounted with the precision of someone reading a map to prove that the recorded moments were real. Victor's counsel argued consent, argued manipulation, argued that Helena had overreached in assembling a narrative that fit the recordings. The judge listened, then let the evidence speak. There were tense days when Helena sat in the back and watched Victor smile into cameras as if he were auditioning for sympathy. There were other days when Helena listened as her children spoke in controlled
statements, their voices small and difficult but true. There were moments when the past she had avoided returned like a wave and pushed her toward grief all over again. Yet the law, with all its slow wheels, turned toward a form of accountability. During the most crucial hearing, a new piece of evidence was submitted. Ava Lynn had obtained a series of time-stamped messages from Victor's phone, showing him coordinating schedules and payments that would make private discipline into organized control. The prosecution used it to show pattern and intent. In the courtroom, lines of dialogue between counsel became almost theatrical, but beneath them lay the real beating heart of the story: children who had been spoken into silence. The judge permitted a protective order and placed Victor under supervised contact restrictions while the case went forward. It was not a complete victory, but it was a ripping open of the house's secrecy. The word rescind arrived like a small sun. The highest tension came on the day Helena confronted Victor alone within the safe setting of a legal room, under the watchful eyes of counsel and an official present. Victor tried again to recast the narrative. He leaned toward her and said with a soft fury, "You will never be rid of me." Helena answered in a voice she had been polishing like silverware. She said, "I will build a life where my children do not flinch at kindness." She did not shout. She did not beg. She spoke the firm, controlled sentences of a woman who had learned to convert power into protection. He heard that and tried to bargain. The exchanges multiplied, each one an attempt to prod, to frighten, to reclaim authority. Helena had rehearsed her words, but the room had a quality of honesty that rehearsal bleached out. There were moments when memory invaded her thought. She saw again the portrait in the foyer and imagined it redone, not as a thing to hold past sins, but as a testament to what they were going to build. It felt like a radical thing to say in a legal room: "We will be okay." She whispered those words like a spell, as Peter the lawyer signed documents behind them. The end of the legal arc was not cinematic. Victor pleaded to a reduced charge in an arrangement that acknowledged the evidence and punished accordingly. He was ordered to attend court-ordered counseling and to have no unsupervised contact with the children. The agreement was imperfect but enforceable. The house, which had seemed to stand as an accomplice to its own secrecy, began to reweave the threads of routine under new rules and new watchers. The neighborhood's curiosity softened into a cautious respect. The staff, who had been living inside a tension they could not name, began to breathe again. Miguel returned to his mop and to the pride of a job done with new dignity. Lydia continued to read the children's books and to make up silly songs, a small, miraculous domestic ministry. Priya reorganized household budgets and insisted on transparency. Darren volunteered to sit through parenting classes to learn better routes to support. Ava Lynn closed her notebook and, one evening, brought a small plant as a housewarming for Helena, a gesture that felt like permission to heal. Healing larger than the law came slower and required intention. Helena began therapy with Dr. Jameson, who taught her to move from strategy to presence. She learned to sit with her oldest son as he explained why he had not told her something that had hurt, to name the timber of fear without fixing it with schedules or money. She learned to be present in the refrigerator hum of breakfast, to answer with curiosity instead of solutions. The children, in their own time, began to trust the rhythm of a home that now kept consistent boundaries. They brought the faded lion toy to therapy and stitched it back together with bright thread. The symbol of the toy became a kind of map of resilience. On some nights, Helena would lie awake and listen to the house breathe, counting the soft creaks that once intimated threat and now spoke of ordinary life. 1 month after Victor's removal, the household had routines that were solid and kind. A calendar on the kitchen wall had color-coded entries that included family time and nothing that smelled like work. Helena would often sit at the kitchen island and watch her children fold paper boats and chase them in the sink. The lemon oil scent was still there, but now mixed with the smell of fresh bread and the subtle musk of a comforting blanket. Miguel had a new key, but this time it was because Helena insisted on it. He lent her a small smile across morning coffee and said, "We did the right thing." The children still flinched sometimes when a stranger's voice was loud, but they were returning to a place where their noises would be accepted without judgment. Helena made time to be at the bedside for one story each night. She could not erase the months she had been absent, but she could build rituals that showed up for the days ahead. At 3 months, the legal restrictions had held. Victor's public attempts to rehabilitate his image were muffled by records and a small, enduring community memory. The staff had gone through a training program organized by Helena, a set of classes on safeguarding and communication led by Dr. Jameson and coordinated by Priya. The skin of the household felt thicker for it. The children had begun playing with friends again. Helena had started a small nonprofit that focused on home safety inspections and support for families who could not see what was happening inside their own walls. It was, in part, an attempt to transform private shame into public service. She worked with Officer Nolan to set up emergency protocols and with Ava Lynn to create workshops on ethical evidence for people who might otherwise be silenced. Camille visited more often. They picked paint colors together. There were afternoons when Helena would laugh at a joke that had nothing to do with meetings or returns. The lion toy sat on a shelf now, no longer a symbol of fear, but a token of repair. At 6 months, the family had a rhythm that felt like recovery rather than precautions. Victor's contact was minimal and supervised, and the children understood boundaries with clarity. The house had become a place of small triumphs, a backyard picnic that lasted through a whole afternoon without interruption, a school play where the youngest recited his lines and looked out into the audience as if the world were safe for him to do so, breakfasts where the milk did not slosh from being poured too quickly. Helena had changed in ways that went beyond public image and into bone memory. She had learned to put down her phone during dinner. She had learned to tell her children in small concrete ways, "I am here." The staff had become a team of witnesses who also cared. Miguel, who had once been simply a janitor, had been promoted to head of household security, a title that came with respect and not just keys. Lydia had started an after-school music hour. Priya had become the guardian of transparency, filing monthly reports that Helena read over with her morning tea. Ava Lynn smiled when she saw the family photo on Helena's desk, the children's faces bright and not shadowed. The process of rebuilding was not linear. There were days of old grief, nights when Helena would wake and the house would feel too big and empty. But then there would be a phone call from a mother in the city who had watched the story unwind on the news and said, "I saw you stand up for your children, and I found my own courage." Those calls, the small acts of recognition and reciprocal bravery, were stitches in a new fabric. Helena continued to see Dr. Jameson and to teach classes at her nonprofit. She met with Officer Nolan to advise on policy and to speak to neighborhood groups about the quiet ways harm can enter family life. She had a new board of staff, including Priya, Miguel, Lydia, Darren, Ava, and Camille, each with defined roles and the mandate to protect. They were not a perfect team, but they were a community willing to sustain the work of safekeeping. In public, Helena became more candid, not about the sensational details, but about what she had learned. She spoke at a symposium on domestic surveillance within ethical bounds, emphasizing the need to balance privacy and protection. She insisted on supporting communities with resources and not just statements. She created a small fund to help households with private safety assessments and to subsidize therapy for children who had experienced fear. Her speeches were measured. Her presence was less about power and more about stewardship. The house itself, once a mute witness, now held rituals that were intentionally small and healing. The lion toy was repaired properly and held center stage on a shelf where it was visible and ordinary. The house had stopped pretending to be perfect and started to be present. If viewers find themselves holding the sharp edge of this story, there is a request that comes from the center of it. Listen, and if you hear something that does not fit, say something in small ways that are safe. A comment, a voice, an "I saw" will often be the push someone needs to move from private fear to public safety. The final image was simple and quiet. Helena, at dusk, standing at the threshold of the nursery with a cup of tea, watching her son sleep. He shifted in the bed and smiled like any child who dreams of small adventures. Her hand rested on the lion toy. She had learned to keep doors open, not to make herself vulnerable to harm, but to make her household less hospitable to it. The house answered her with soft sounds, the floors settling, the pipes sighing, life moving inside the walls with ordinary grace. She had been found out, and in being found out, she had found a way to rebuild. The last line she would sometimes repeat in the privacy of midnight was this: "The truth is more fierce than any charm and kinder than silence."